I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Alex. And I'm really just excited to get to see so many of our collaborators shine tonight. So let's snap for that. Yes, we're gonna watch them shine. It's gonna be great. But I wanted to start really I want to start at the beginning, which is actually at the end, because Kate Darling's last chapter has a bit of a free culture moment. For those of you who are not so familiar with the free culture movement, it was a big groundswell in the early aughts and mid aughts that had community groups on campuses that were dedicated to promoting copyright reform, which is kind of wild to think that there used to be clubs on campus that were dedicated to something like copyright reform. And they were grounded in information wants to be free. They were grounded in the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace. They were grounded in Creative Commons. And I came into that movement as a cool college kid who created her own major in publishing, copyright, and technology because I was very fun. And I started showing up to free culture events, and I felt so weird. I felt very other at these movements. One, I didn't look like a lot of the people at the movement. A lot of them looked like the kinds of people you think would be interested in copyright reform in 2009, right? Stereotypical hacker bros thinking about a better internet for a certain kind of person. Because when I looked at some of the free culture principles that were underpinning our work, I heard information wants to be free. And I thought, my nudes don't want to be free. My biometrics don't want to be free. My reproductive health information doesn't want to be free. And speaking of reproductive health information, it used to be that when you were trying to follow a certain open source coding guide pioneered by Richard Stallman, who inspired Lawrence Lessig and Larry Lessig's premise of free culture, you used to have to read kind of a tacky abortion joke that was framed as being a comment on restrictions on abortion, when really, if you were a women coder who'd ever made reproductive choices for yourself, it just reminded you that a man was there to tell you more about your body than you could. And you know who else wasn't going to tell you about your body? John Perry Barlow. When he wrote the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace, he talked about socioeconomic status and race and the ways that we would be freed from these kinds of conventions in cyberspace. But he didn't talk about gender or sexuality or disability. And all of those came up again when we looked at the composition of the original Creative Commons board, which was a very impressive slate of men. And so I was always wondering, where am I in this movement? Because copyright still felt like a home to me. I had grown up working for indie presses. That's what turned me on to copyright in the first place and inspired me to create a major all around that legal issue. But the way that I saw copyright was a little bit different than some of my colleagues and some of my peers. And I realized that when I started writing my student note. I proposed, based on what I was seeing in 2014 and 2013, a rash of hate crimes against women online in the form of non-consensual intimate imagery. And I am fundamentally broken inside because everything hits a copyright alarm bell in my brain. Like every ping of the pinball is hitting a copyright light up. And I looked at this problem and I said, well, these women are usually taking selfies, which makes them the author of their image, and it makes them the copyright owner. And we have this very annoying, very controversial law called the Digital Millennium Copyright Act that a lot of the people, including some on this stage, have worked on reforming. And I said, why can't we use this law to send a notice and takedown, just like someone from the RIAA might, or BMI trying to get a song removed? You know, why can't we make that more accessible for victims of non-consensual intimate imagery? And so I went to my supervisor, my professor at the time, and I asked if I could write a student note about it. And he said yes. And so I did. And what he didn't tell me, and he didn't know that I was going to go into academia, so I have to give him some grace for this, is he did not tell me that I was wandering into a decades-long debate with some of the most prominent voices in copyright about whether copyright should be used to protect against privacy harms. And I published my note, and I got a lot of backlash from colleagues around the country who were very well-meaning and very kind. But I wanted to ask them, why do you only care when copyright is being wielded or weaponized, if you want to use some of their words, when it helps marginalized people, but not when it suppresses speech or curtails creativity, because it's the same tool doing the same thing. But now, because there's a different target group who may not have been intended by Congress when the DMCA was passed, and almost certainly was not, now you're mad about it. And that never sat right with me. And I kept following some of the narrative storytelling that had inspired me by people I would consider feminist cyberlaw inspo, right? If they were making a Pinterest board of feminist cyberlaw, these badasses would be on it. And it would be Anita Allen and Danielle Citron and Pam Samuelson. And when I thought about the things that sort of unified their scholarship, that inspired me, it was all about the humanity of their storytelling. The storytelling that Anita Allen told about Jennifer Ringley, who actually then in turn inspired a piece of my scholarship called Defragging Feminist Cyberlaw, which in turn inspired this book. We're like in Inception land right now. And then I also kept thinking critically about how we could keep using copyright to combat these harms against women. So some of the women that I've written about are Jennifer Lawrence as a victim of non-consensual intimate imagery, and how the method I pioneered in my scholarship actually helped her and a bunch of other celebrities get their images taken down from Reddit after their nudes were hacked. I've written about it in the context of face surveillance and women like Portia Woodruff, who was arrested when she was 8 months pregnant based on faulty face surveillance information. And I've written about it in the context of AI that flattens non-white features and sexualizes women, as Mia Marcato experienced when she was working for The Cut, investigating a piece about mid-journey instability and the kinds of stereotypes that are built into our AI systems. But that's anecdata. That's great for a tenure file, but that's not a recipe for a movement. And like I mentioned earlier, I wrote a piece called Defragging Feminist Cyberlaw that tried to set up some of the values that I thought were really central to this unifying principle of cyberlaw, which is it has always been a reaction to and against feminist values. There's a lot of other ways to unify it. Judge Easterbrook was flatly wrong about the fact that there's no unifying characteristic of cyberlaw or of cyberspace. But it was a little different than what people have been talking about. And you could see it in scholarship going back to Anita Allen's work all the way through when we were working through. And this provides a definition, which is I define feminist cyberlaw as when gender, race, sexuality, disability, and class shape cyberspace and the laws that govern it. There's a lot of wiggle room there. And the first thing I knew is when I started writing my article, I did not want to be the voice of feminist cyberlaw. This was going to be an interdisciplinary, intersectional, and intermodal movement if it was going to work. If we were going to actually try to change the shape of the discourse, try to change the shape of policymaking, try to change the shape that the way that we train future lawyers in thinking about these problems. And so I got together with my dear colleague, Meg Lita Jones, who basically adopted me as a sister as soon as I started at Georgetown and was like, we're going to make trouble together. And when I got a call from a publisher, I did an event while I was moving apartments, actually. And she called me and she's like, hey, what other ideas do you have? And I was like, what do you mean? And she's like, what's a pie in the sky idea that you have that you think would like be cool to work on? And I was like, an anthology called Feminist Cyberlaw with a bunch of contributors on a range of topics. And she was like, great, let's do that. And I was like, oh, is that how one gets a book deal these days? Great, sounds awesome. What a brilliant. And that's really how this began. And then I made a list of all my favorite people that I thought were brilliant, beautiful geniuses. And Meg made a list of all the brilliant, beautiful people she knew. And we really did want it to be interdisciplinary. There are non-lawyers writing in a volume about cyberlaw because cyberlaw problems are not going to be solved just by lawyers, just like engineering problems are not going to just be solved by engineers. We wanted it to be intersectional. I am so proud of how diverse our authorship is. And it's not because we were trying to cherry pick people for the diversity points. It's because when you're looking this broadly at a movement, it is diverse. There are lots of people with lots of views. And I don't just mean in how they look. There are a lot of types of feminisms represented in this book. There's certainly sort of the bell hooks feminism. There's intersectional Kimberly Crenshaw feminism. There's even Winks-Hit radical feminism and Catherine McKinnon's approach. But there's also abolitionist feminism and queer feminism and reproductive health feminism that are really centered on a different range of issues because there is not one feminism in this book. And that was something that was so important to me and Meg because we don't consider ourselves feminist law scholars, right? We've certainly read texts and we've experienced the world as women, but we also didn't want to be gatekeepers. And we had a number of our contributors come back to us and say, we're incredibly flattered, but we're not feminist scholars. We don't know that we can do this work. And we would look at their work and say, I'm sorry, you think that there should be equitable access for people with disabilities. You're a feminist. Like, they weren't saying they weren't feminists. They were just saying they weren't feminist scholars, right? They hadn't read all the readings and done all the homework. And we said, it's really important for you to just show up as feminists and have that be part of a feminist cyber law movement, right? We're not here to gatekeep or girl, I'm a little girl boss, but not really girl boss. And that's how we got to this sort of intersectional place around, yes, one type of feminism is inspirational to me, but there are other types of feminisms represented in this book. And I feel like that sometimes gets lost in conversations with our authors about like what lens they're looking through. People assume that because I have a lens, they're looking through my lens, and they're very much not. Everyone is bringing their own perspective, as you're going to hear today. And the final thing I wanted to make sure was that this was intra-method. Yes, we wanted scholars. This is an academic press. It's a cyber law book. Like, we got the scholars. We checked the box. But to me and Meg, it was also really important that we had practitioners. And to me, as a clinician, it was very important to me that we had clinicians, because I really wanted pieces of this book to be broken up and read in classrooms, whether they were traditional cyber law classes. But I think a lot of these readings, particularly one of the pieces you're going to read tonight by Kendra, is a great addition to any conversation you're having about Section 230, right? Their piece is all about whether Section 230 is an accidental abolitionist intervention or more of a non-reformist reform. All of those are things that students should understand as concepts. And in fact, I just taught my Section 230 unit, and it was a delight to invoke this work to illuminate our broader conversation. And I hope that other people can have the same experiences with this book that I'm having, which is I've used it in my class already. My students actually came to me and they wanted to do a piece about owning words. And I was like, oh my gosh, Alex Roberts' piece from Feminist Cyberlaw is exactly what you're talking about. And my students were able to assign it to their peers and facilitate a conversation about words that someone wrote for a book that I co-edited. And to me, that's like the biggest success of this project, because it's not just me using this book in the classroom. I've heard anecdotally that it's being used across the country to augment, supplement, and I hope one day supplant some of the traditional readings that we're used to. I would love to see more classes assign John Perry Barlow alongside Medlita Jones and assign, information about the free culture movement alongside the juxtaposition of Kate Darling's wonderful intervention. And then alongside all those pieces, there were just some really quirky turns that I wasn't prepared for, like Yvonne and Victoria's piece, which is so radical and does so much work around how we think about care in AI, which is such an important conversation. And it was such a pleasure to draw all these authors together. I think I did contribute an essay because no one wanted to write a copyright essay for a book called Feminist Cyberlaw back in the day, but that's okay, I did. But we've now gotten to a place where I think more and more people are excited to be doing their own thing. And I now have students being like, I want to write a feminist cyber law take on the CFAA. She did, and it was about how the CFAA promotes propaganda, and it was awesome. And so that's my hope, is that I hope this book is an engine, right? We are the thing that we are. We are the book that's in front of you or in the back of you, depending on where you're located in space and time. But we're also propelling people onto other things, right? We're giving opportunities for junior scholars, mid-level scholars, and even more senior established scholars to have space to talk about something they normally wouldn't be talking about. We have an opportunity to bring students in and get them excited about cyber law in a new way that speaks to the way that they're thinking about these issues, not just the way that we were thinking about it 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago when I was a little babe in the free culture movement. And so yes, I think that information may want to be free, but it's our job to make sure information is feminist. And if you are looking for a handbook on how to make information feminist, and data feminist, and AI feminist, and reproductive health feminist, and data security feminist, this is the book for you. And I hope you enjoy the hell out of it.
Thank you, that was a great introduction. Oh, that's me, that's not you.
If you go to view, I think you can get that room.
All right. We're good. So Kendra Albert, whose work was just mentioned, is our next speaker. Kendra is a partner at Albert Sellars LLP, public interest technology and media law firm. Previously, they taught law students how to practice law at the Cyberlaw Clinic at Harvard Law School, and also ran the initiative for a representative First Amendment, which provided funding and support for students interested in pursuing freedom of expression work. Kendra's writing on questions of technology, gender, and power has been published in the New York Times, Wired, Harvard Civil Rights, Civil Liberties Law Review. I might be missing a comma there, NACM. They serve on the board of the TOR project. And Kendra received a JD from Harvard Law School and a bachelor's from Carnegie Mellon. In their free time, they enjoy cooking, playing video games, and reading 990s. Kendra's chapter is called Accidental Abolition, Exploring Section 230 as Non-Reformist Reform. So I know some of us were able to see Carrie Goldberg speak when she was in residence last week. And I had a great breakfast conversation with her. She visited a number of classrooms. I think that you will find Kendra's and Carrie's work and their positions on Section 230 speak to each other and are in dialogue in some really interesting ways.
Thank you so much, Alex. And thank you, Amanda, for the kind introduction and sort of beautiful walkthrough of the history of this volume. And my gratitude to Amanda and Meg for the opportunity to write this piece, and Alex and Jennifer for pulling together the panels with an opportunity to talk about how cool this book is. So as Amanda sort of previewed, the starting point for my chapter was Section 230, which, I'm not going to assume that everybody in this room sort of lives and breathes Section 230 in the way that perhaps I do, or Carrie Goldberg does, which is a law that sort of makes it very difficult to hold online intermediaries responsible for the content of, produced by their users. And I think when Amanda and Meg initially approached me and asked me to write about Section 230, I think what I said was, sure, but I want to write about whether it's an example of abolition feminism. And they were like, okay. Because the starting point for my chapter was sort of this observation, right? That the way we talk about Section 230 is, there's a lot of debate about sort of what it allows for, who it harms, but we don't really talk about it as quite possibly the single largest exception to state criminal law that has ever been passed by Congress, which it is. Section 230 immunizes online platforms from claims under state criminal law for the actions of their users. And that the scholarship on 230 doesn't really sort of deal with that question, in part because nobody spends a lot of, people may not spend a lot of time thinking about that sort of state criminal law exception. If that sounds sort of abstract to you, I'm going to read a little bit of how I sort of explain in the piece what that means in practice. So if, for example, North Carolina passed a law making it a crime to aid and abet the sharing of information about self-managed abortion, online service providers whose facilities are used for that information could face criminal liability. An online service provider, say a small forum, who had not banned their users from discussing abortion could be prosecuted under the law after a user self-manages an abortion based on information shared by another user. But Section 230 is the thing that would prevent that online forum from being held criminally liable for that the speech of their users, even if that speech would otherwise be found, or even if the forum's intervention would otherwise be found to rise to the level of aiding and abetting under state criminal law. As I read this, I'm like, well, there's 6 other ways you could, prevent that prosecution. Not that I spend a lot of time thinking about this these days. But so my point there is to say that there's something sort of interesting about Section 230. If we sort of take it not from the starting point, which I think sort of Amanda sort of pointed out, of its sort of role in the kind of largest grant of immunity, for online platforms, but rather as sort of a very weird intervention into state criminal law. And I draw parallels between the arguments for Section 230 and broader critiques of policing, questioning how they could apply each to the other. So I'm going to read a little bit of that. In the context of Section 230, we often see amongst people who sort of are otherwise engaged in sort of internet law and policy Widespread agreement that state criminal law is arbitrary, uneven, holds the wrong people to account, is fundamentally repressive, and does not successfully deal with real problems. Although not all of these are abolitionist arguments, right? When I say abolitionist, I'm talking about police or prison abolition, just for context. It is fascinating to see critiques that could be crafted to describe the felony murder rule or conspiracy liability used to suggest avoiding online liability for online platforms. What does it mean in the context of the internet, state criminal law has been accepted and by sort of many folks as an arbitrary negative force that prevents the operators of platforms from dealing with content in ways that generally promote harm reduction? How could this analysis be expanded to so many other spaces where criminal liability eliminates pro-social options? So I'll let you read the article to answer that question. No, but I do want to say that I'm going to sort of go from there, which is the thing that kind of I contributed to the volume, and sort of leave there the kind of conversation about whether Section 230 counts as non-reformist reform, which I use a set of questions developed by critical resistance. To sort of try and sort of work through how it relates to broader questions about what constitutes abolition and what interventions are worth pursuing. I want to take the remainder of my time to talk a little bit about how I see feminist cyberlaw after this book and in this moment. As Kate says in her conclusion, much of the work here in the book provides new frameworks to examine our challenges, as well as creative ideas as how to address them, outlining bold, constructive paths towards change. And following on that, I want to offer a challenge to all of us as we sort of contemplate feminist cyber law, to use the cyber law as a Trojan horse for the feminism. Earlier this week, I was in DC. Folks kept asking me if I was in DC because I wanted to attend Frank McCourt's Summit on the Future of the Internet. Frank McCourt, if you don't know, is a billionaire who I'm seeing some laughing from folks in the audience who shall remain nameless. He's a billionaire who's funded a number of technology initiatives, including events I've participated in. That summit is today and tomorrow. One of the opening speakers for Frank McCourt's summit was Nancy Mace. Nancy Mace, for those who don't know, is the woman behind the successful attempt to bar Sarah McBride, the first out transgender member of Congress, from using the appropriate bathroom on Capitol Hill. Nancy Mace spoke at the summit on the future of the internet today. God knows what she said about tech policy. To be honest, I don't really care. Many of my fellow travelers are at that event today. Some of them walked out of her talk. Some of them likely said nothing. Some of them probably did not even remember why Nancy Mace's name sounded familiar as she was in. Even just thinking about this triggers the raw nerve that I've been feeling, this week and many weeks, but this week in particular. This week where I went to a happy hour in DC and listened to someone imply that transgender people were the reason that Kamala Harris lost the election. This week, which was also, yesterday was Transgender Day of Remembrance, where we remember those who died in violence in the last year. This week, where I sat on a plane thinking again about a phrase I heard at a poetry reading for Transgender Day of Remembrance many years ago here in Boston. There is no trans suicide, there is only murder. Nancy Mace's speaking slot is not the moment where tech gained gender politics. We could look as far back as Lambda Moo and Julian Dipple's A Rape in Cyberspace, or more recently to Israel's use of gender and algorithms to target its war crimes in Gaza. You can read every essay in the book, and all of them will talk about the gender politics. Many of these essays remind us on topics from abortion to hashtags that there are significant consequences to the topics within cyber law. But sometimes cyber law can feel like a space where we can escape those stakes, where we can work through ideas that are separate from the distributional consequences they result in. With our cyber law hats on, we are invited into rooms where our feminist selves are not welcome, or at least not expected. They want your opinion on copyright or trademark or the CFAA or something else. They ask you to come say something about Section 230, and all you want to talk about is abolition or anti-trans violence. That's what Evan Greer did today in DC. Evan got up during the Summit of the Internet, or Summit on the Future of the Internet, or whatever it's called, and asked Nancy Mace, "We've had dozens of trans people die this year because of the lies that you're spreading. Is this the future of the internet we want? Are we building an internet with free speech and safety for all people, or just the privileged few?" I encourage each and every one of you and of us to take these opportunities that we are given to talk about cyber law and use them to not just talk about feminist cyber law, but also just feminism, and to use them to be in solidarity with those who's experienced the violence of the status quo. Thanks.
Really powerful, Kendra, thank you.
Make me cry before
Our next speaker is Victoria Sanchez, who is a diversity, equity, and inclusion professional leading global inclusion programs and projects. She is a people project manager right now at Riot Games, where she supports cross-functional programs and initiatives to expand opportunities for underrepresented players and champion inclusion across Riot's departments, products, and ERGs. Victoria writes about feminist STS, ethical AI supply chains, interactive media and games, and Latina studies. Victoria is a proud Posse alumna from Carleton College and holds an MA in Latin American and Latino studies from UC Santa Cruz. Go Banana Slugs. She is a Women in Games ambassador, an International Game Developer Association Foundation's Next Generation leader, and a mentor at Latinas in Tech. In her spare time, you can catch Victoria gaming, training for the LA Marathon, engaging in her Buddhist community, practicing Portuguese, or taking deep breaths on her patio garden in LA, which I gotta tell you sounds really good right now because Boston is grim today. Victoria's chapter is co-authored with Yvonne Char Lopez, and it's titled Artificial Intelligence, Microwork, and the Radical Politics of Care. Victoria, give me 1 second, I wanna make you, nope. I always do. What you got? Fabulous. Okay, we're ready for you.
Awesome. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much for the invitation to be with you here today. I feel so honored, slightly like out of my league and fangirling that I get to be on a panel with these incredible scholars and thinkers. I'm a bit of an oddball on this panel because I actually currently work in the gaming industry, as was introduced, and most of my career has been, as was mentioned, focusing on furthering diversity and inclusion efforts in gaming and esports, especially around championing authentically diverse representation and stories in gaming. But before I began my really short career in gaming, I worked with my brilliant co-author, Dr. Yvonne Char Lopez, in his Border Tech Lab at the University of Texas, Austin, where this project really got its start. So about 3 years ago, I had finished my graduate studies at UC Santa Cruz in Latin American Latino studies. I was living in San Francisco, working in philanthropy, kind of figuring out what to do next. I was already deeply familiar with Dr. Char Lopez's work at the time. And if you haven't read any of his work, please do. It's incredible. And I discovered that he actually had a lab at UT Austin, the Border Tech Lab. So I reached out to him with interest in working in his lab. And to my surprise, he said yes and admitted me to his lab as a visiting researcher. So together with the lab members from UT Austin and under his direction, we began to read and study a lot about the gig economy, labor, and science and technology studies together. And it was really from those dialogues and those bodies of literature that I proposed that Yvonne and I look deeper into ethical AI supply chains and labor and ground that research in a San Francisco organization that had caught my attention at the time called Sama Source, who at the time were positioning themselves as a company at the forefront of designing and investing in designing an ethical AI supply chain is what they called. So Yvonne and I were not lawyers, but we're both trained in qualitative methods from social sciences and the humanities, such as critical race and feminist science and technology studies, and a little bit of ethnography, which we ultimately ended up using as our primary method for this chapter. So essentially, we take an ethnographic dive into the racial politics of AI labor and digital infrastructure maintenance in our chapter to delve deeper into Sama Source's ethical AI supply chain. So that said, that brings me to our chapter. What is our chapter about? As was mentioned, the title is Artificial Intelligence, Microwork, and actually the racial politics of care. And what we're interested in understanding is thinking about the racialized labor practices and the tensions that are inherent to Samasource's racial politics of care. In relation to labor by analyzing the organization's plans, its relations to benchmark tech companies, and its experimental practices with philanthropic policymaking groups. So we read alongside legal scholars, critical race scholars, feminist STS scholars on the politics of care, among many others. And what we really wanted to understand in our chapter are two questions. So the first one is, what kinds of ethics emerge when engaging with the affordances of Samasource's plans for microwork supply chains? And then the second one is, how is Black and non-white labor entrenched as the invisible infrastructure of AI, often through practices of repair work? And then what are some of the ramifications of this socio-technical arrangement? So to do this, to answer these questions, we unsettled dominant understandings of the politics of care by tracing these relations not as necessarily beneficial, but as potentially detrimental. So writing about and understanding their ethical AI supply chain, Samasource's ethical AI supply chain, it really required a kind of feminist critical race analytics. These human and machine configurations are made through complex situations that can't be neatly bounded as strict kind of technical procedures. So what we do is we take that ethnographic dive into the racial politics of AI labor and digital infrastructure maintenance to really argue that the legislative efforts to continually classify and reclassify workers preserve this kind of distinction about which bodies provide exploitable labor. So I've said Samasource a couple of times. You'll get to know and learn more about them in our chapter. But to talk a little bit about them here, Samasource was formerly a nonprofit organization that turned into a business that was founded in San Francisco in 2008. And they've been, as I mentioned, at the forefront of these discussions and projects that were looking to kind of enact an ethical AI supply chain. So the organization would mostly hire and train unemployed workers and gig workers from places like Haiti and Kenya and Uganda, and actually even low-income communities in the United States to perform data labeling and other kinds of digital micro work through their SAMA schools. Its prioritization of the management of labor was actually for a range of companies like Google and Microsoft and Canva. And their intervention was actually informed and partially funded through the Rockefeller Foundation and what they called impact sourcing. So impact sourcing was this kind of purportedly inclusive employment practice to hire and provide career development opportunities to populations who were excluded from the digital economy. So when Lila Jana, who was the founder of the organization, what she did was she wanted to set out to disrupt a kind of philanthropic and outsourcing models by essentially providing workers with what she called a livable wage and to give folks jobs rather than aid or charity. So you'll hear her saying this a lot in her work and in Samasource as a business, is that this is, quote, like the power of work over charity, she would say. She's often giving pitches to folks who are investing in her company that the primary goal for them is to give work rather than aid, and to tackle poverty with technology and AI to create jobs for folks that she would say were at the bottom of the pyramid. And that is where her pitch for her project for an ethical AI supply chain was for this room full of tech investors that you'll read in our first chapter. And that's really Jana and Samasource's articulation of the first sense of the racial politics of care, which was this care toward people in the global South meant to protect them by enrolling their labor in the making of the modern technological world. But what we argue in this chapter is that the ethical AI supply chain that she discusses that's so central to Samasource was actually based on a unique model of philanthropy that was not concerned with providing displaced and marginalized populations with access to goods or services, but rather it enacted this kind of altruistic mode of care by seeking to incorporate these populations into the global labor market, namely the global digital labor market. So ultimately, what we argue is that Samasource's impact sourcing enacted this kind of neoliberal logics of self-government with the feminist sensibility towards repair work, right? So the organization sought to repair these broken relations, excluding many from the global market economy, especially the global digital market economy, by instituting an outsourcing program that trained and integrated those at the margins. So to kind of care for the excluded was to bring them into the fold of global capital. But even as Samasource was seeking to construct a socio-technical organization of humans as a service, this actually was not a universal project, right? So rather it was a tightly defined one whereby already vulnerable populations, often Black and non-white migrant refugees and underrepresented communities from low-income backgrounds in the gig economy were kind of locked into this precarious labor arrangement that undermined their access to better wages and labor rights. So through Samasource's training programs, as you'll read in the chapter for gig workers, as data labelers and micro workers, were made to care for informational systems and a tech industry that conscripted them as invisible labor. So analyzing Samasource's ethical supply chain through this framework of the racial politics of care helps us really draw out asymmetries in care work while also grappling with its ambivalence. As with the case of Samasource, their racial politics of care operated through this kind of integration of predominantly Black and non-white workers as AI's invisible labor. But such labor first had to be made available and able to work in AI development. So how does this all fit into feminist cyber law, right? So in our chapter, we discuss and examine several legal frameworks surrounding gig work and the debate over worker classification. We have discussed a couple of notable bills in California that you'll read about, and also efforts at the federal level, including the Employee Rights Act of 2022 and the Worker Flexibility and Choice Act of 2022 as well. And what we argue, as I mentioned kind of at the beginning of this presentation, is that legislative efforts to continually classify and reclassify workers preserve a kind of distinction about which bodies provide exploitable labor. So, for example, the reclassification of gig workers as employees, it does not undo the differential relations of racial capital, but preserves those distinctions made about whose bodies are deemed extractable, whose labor is exploitable under conditions beneficial for global capital. So I'll end here by just saying that we finally argue that the racial politics of care, as I've been talking about throughout my presentation, is a very helpful analytical lens for us to grapple with situated and differentiated ambivalences in gig work, in micro work, and in the configuration of neoliberal technologies across enriching and depletion zones. So I hope that you read our chapter and tell us what you think. Thank you so much.
Okay, looking forward. You took care of it, awesome. Let's go back to the slides.
Sure.
Fabulous.
How long?
10 minutes.
10 minutes.
So I had written previously about hashtags as trademarks in a paper called Tag Marks. And when I wrote it in 2016, companies were just starting to explore whether and when a hashtag could be a trademark. So there were only about 200 what I call tag mark registrations, but you can see how quickly they were accelerating. So now, of course, there are many thousands. And a trademark, as some of you know from my classes, can be anything, right? It can be anything, any kind of name or symbol or device, as long as it does what a trademark needs to do. So as long as a producer uses it in connection with goods or services in interstate commerce to indicate the source of the goods and distinguish them from the goods of others, right? Meanwhile, a hashtag is a word or phrase used on social media to organize posts or images related to a particular topic. And hashtags started to kind of come off of social media. So you can see in some cases, they do start to look like protectable trademarks. But in other cases, there are a lot of limitations or challenges. So there were a lot of reasons that these applications to register hashtags as trademarks either were getting refused or frankly should have been refused but weren't, right? And I'm going to focus here on the last three. Those are the most relevant to this project, right? So informational matter essentially is a refusal that means the use is so widespread, a use of a phrase or slogan, that people will be incapable of connecting it with a single source, right? So this is the basis for refusal for marks like Drive Safely or I Heart DC or Made in the USA. Hashtags are by nature collective, they're collaborative, and a trademark for goods or services needs to be associated with just one source. Whereas a hashtag encourages people to use it, and people are going to expect that it comes from many different sources. So that can be a big limiting factor. When I talk about informational slogan and use as a mark, those are two different kinds of failure to function. So a mark can fail to function because the use is so widespread, or it can fail to function because it's just not being used in a trademark way. Right, so some of these images, I mean, when you put something on the front of a shirt, when you put it in an ad like this, when you use it actually on social media in a way that people can click on it, that's not a use that looks like trademark use. That's gonna basically train consumers to understand something as a mark, which is what needs to happen for trademark protection. So what I wanted to do in this chapter, what I set out to do was kind of revisit this project from a feminist perspective. And of course, we have systemic imbalances in trademark as we do in other areas of intellectual property. Black and Hispanic applicants are underrepresented in trademark applications and registrations, as are women. White and male applicants are overrepresented. Trademark registration as a system privileges those with resources, with information, with access to lawyers, and access to kind of information on the front end about how best to use something to acquire trademark rights and then to avail yourself of those rights. So how have these seemingly neutral rules about protectability and ownership affected the hashtags and the catchphrases that originated with members of minoritized communities? It's no coincidence that so many viral hashtags, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, Oscar So White, Love Wins, were created by women or people of color because the hashtag has emerged as a way to center marginalized people and give voice to grassroots movements. And in fact, Black Twitter in particular uses hashtags to create a kind of counter-public within a public space to better communicate about and amplify issues relevant to participants' experiences and concerns. So some examples, hashtag Say Her Name is a social movement that has worked to amplify the names and narratives of Black women killed by police and raise awareness about how state violence intersects with race and gender. Kimberly Crenshaw founded the movement, and the organization that she's involved with applied to register the mark, but they received a refusal based on the idea that the mark was an informational slogan. So ironically, the success in making it viral was what impeded the ability of the hashtag to work as a trademark. And we see that kind of repeated with these like community-based, grassroots kind of political hashtags, right? Black Girl Magic is a slightly different story. So that Black Girls Are Magic was coined by Kashawn Thompson in 2013 to celebrate and uplift Black women. At the time I wrote this chapter, I found 45 applications or registrations to trademark this phrase, right? And they're used for everything you can imagine, wine, lipstick, all kinds of different things. So this was a bit more of a corporate co-opting of the phrase, right? Meanwhile, in some other cases, individuals or entities asserted ownership over hashtags that really were created and used by whole communities. And then they turned around and enforced those rights in ways that are inconsistent with trademark's fair use principles. So essentially using their rights to bully and silence others. A couple of examples, hashtag deaf talent was a hashtag used to highlight deaf and hard of hearing actors, and also to call out when hearing actors are cast in roles to play deaf people. And HAES, Health at Every Size, was originated with the fat acceptance movement, but this particular organization registered it, both versions, both of which are ubiquitous as hashtags for education services. And then A11Y, or ally, it's a numeronym, so that's digits in the middle, right? It stands for accessibility. It's been used by digital accessibility practitioners to advocate for accessibility and also to identify content that has been made accessible. And in all three cases, the owners of those registrations, first of all, published like really restrictive guidelines for others' use that are not at all what trademark law requires when we think about policing and enforcement and maintenance. And then second of all, have sent cease and desist letters, have DM'd people when they use the hashtag, and have essentially engaged in a kind of bullying that goes outside the boundaries of what trademark law permits, and that we more typically see from corporations. Which the A11Y was registered by a corporation, Hayes was by a kind of organization, and Deaf Talent by an individual. So this last story happened after I wrote the chapter. So Jules LeBron went viral for a number of TikToks, and one in particular where she uses this phrase, very demure, very mindful. She's talking about like getting ready for work and being professional, how you do your hair and makeup and present yourself at work. And she really put that expression into the zeitgeist, right? There were like all these other viral versions, celebrities talking about being very demure and very mindful, and others applied to register those phrases as trademarks before Jules did. So this was a classic story that we actually have seen a number of times where the creator, who's a Black trans woman, might not be able to or might be impeded in monetizing something that she created because some third party took legal steps to do so first. I do think she still might come out on top. I think there are arguments that can be made for the USPTO. She has since engaged lawyers and has applied to register the marks herself, but it was kind of a sad story and also really fascinating to see how interested people were, right? I got so many calls about this story because everybody wanted to understand it and wanted to kind of get to the bottom of it, which was a nice opportunity to talk about trademark law and also about how this happens to creators of color. So access to formal IP protection requires access to information, capital, and expertise to level the playing field. So how do we do that? Government agencies can play a good role, right? Posting information, making information understandable and really widely available. Creators need competent legal assistance. That can be through law school clinics, with some of the folks in this room have been involved with on either end, right? Pro bono advice and representation. Trademark lawyers should also work to educate themselves about their clients' artistic, political, or entrepreneurial work, and address their own biases and their own gaps in cultural knowledge to ensure effective advocacy. And frankly, that's true in patent law as well and in other areas of IP, right? So when resources are free or low cost, when they're easy to find, when they are designed for lay people, members of groups that have been disenfranchised by IP laws can access the information and the protection necessary to create and formalize and exploit their rights, and in turn, enforce those rights in ways that don't use trademark law to silence the speech of other artists, activists, and creators. So now I get to introduce Dr. Kate Darling, who is a research scientist at the MIT Data Lab and leads the Ethics and Society Research Team at the Boston Dynamics AI Institute. She's the author of The New Breed, and her work explores intersections of robotic technology and society with a particular interest in legal, economic, social, and I don't know what I'm gonna do. Yeah, that's good. Okay. Legal, economic, social, and ethical issues. I'm not awesome at multitasking tonight. I'm doing my best. Dr. Darling runs experiments, holds workshops, writes and speaks about developments in the world of human-robot interaction and where we might find ourselves in the future. She's an affiliate at the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies and a senior co-chair for We Robot, which is the leading conference on legal and policy questions relating to robots. Her work has been featured in Vogue, The New Yorker, The Guardian, BBC, NPR. The list is really long. I'm gonna have to truncate it. Kate holds a law degree and doctorate of sciences from ETH Zurich and an honorary doctorate of sciences from Middlebury College, and also hangs out with robots a lot, right? Is that true? Kate's chapter ends the collection and it's entitled Toward a Feminist Cyberlaw, Aha. In it, she draws connections across the chapters and includes a call to action. So that seemed like a great place for us to end today.
Thank you. I can't believe I have to follow all these brilliant people again. So I wrote the book conclusion, and when Amanda and Meg reached out and they're like, do you want to write a conclusion to this book called Feminist Cyberlaw? I was like, fuck yeah, I don't know what that is, but I'll do that. And but I think what they were kind of envisioning probably is that I would write something about like future technology, like robots, and like how feminist cyber law, you know, the future of feminist cyber law relates to these technologies, robots, AI, that stuff. I mean, that would make sense. That's what I know about, right? And I didn't do that. And I didn't do that because when I started reading the chapters, and by the way, like if you have to read the book if you haven't, like every single chapter blew my mind. This is an incredible volume. I was just blown away by these chapters and the work in this book. And it made me realize that the future of feminist cyber law, or as some would call it cyber law, is not about changes in technology, it's about changes in our way of thinking. And so I think what we need to be doing, now more so than ever probably, is really starting to challenge existing frameworks and narratives and assumptions, and that includes our own. So what I do in the conclusion is I tell this like slightly embarrassing story from when I was at the doing some like IP advisory stuff at the Media Lab, and the background to that is that before I was at MIT, I was a PhD student in law and economics, and I was doing intellectual property stuff, and I was doing like internet and copyright stuff. And this was actually in 2009, which Amanda referenced, and I was like very enamored with the free culture movement, and like with all of this like prolific scholarship and these people in the IP space who were challenging these dominant narratives in IP law that, you know, intellectual property is for innovation, and they're saying, no, it stifles innovation and information should be free. And I had this post-it note on my computer monitor that said, intellectual property is an oxymoron, which is the John Perry Barlow quote. And I was super into it. Yeah. And then I got to MIT, and then so in that same spirit, I started working with the Media Lab director to implement changes, like we instated an open source software, or open source like default for all of the code that we generated in the lab. And one of the things that I also instated was this pledge, this hackathon pledge. So, you know, various people would host hackathons at the lab, and you know, we would have internal people, but also external people would come in. And I made everyone sign this pledge that, you know, all the work done at these hackathons under our roof had to be shared with society. And then one day I was asked to join this call for this hackathon organizer, and the hackathon was called Make the Breast Pump Not Stop, which is such a good name. I thought like it was a cool hackathon, and like it was like more so than any other hackathon I've ever seen. They're really trying to be inclusive and like putting a lot of effort. They were like flying in people who otherwise wouldn't have the opportunity to like come to MIT and do something like this. One of the participants who's going to fly in had some concerns about the IP pledge, and so I was used to this. So I got on the call, and you know, she was like, well, if we're giving it away, I know there are companies sponsoring this hackathon, they're going to be present. Can't they, you know, steal our work? How are we going to be protected? And I was so used to answering this, like MIT students would ask me this, and like tech people would ask me this, and I was always like, oh, well, you know, we're all about sharing, but also I've seen over and over again that companies aren't interested in stealing your work. Companies, if you're doing something cool, like they'll want to work with you. Like it's not worth it to them to steal it. They'll hire you or they'll fund your startup or whatever. And the call kind of went silent. And then Catherine, who was the hackathon organizer, was like kind of gently like, well, like, hey, like, have you thought about this from the perspective that, you know, Black women historically have been denied credit for their work and had their work stolen? And because this participant was from a team of Black women from Detroit who were bringing kind of an existing project to the lab to like iterate on it, this hackathon. And I was like, oh, and like, because like obviously she's right, like the history is undeniable. It's still happening today. We just heard another example from Alex, right? And like in my field, like you constantly see like Black women being denied credit for their work, like Black women exposing all of the like the bias in facial recognition systems, and then 60 Minutes doing this whole segment where like that's never mentioned, like Joyful and We Need Timid Gabriel, like they knew that they existed, they talked to all of them before the show, but then like no one was mentioned in the show. So like this happens constantly, right? But I just hadn't thought about how like my idealistic rule that like we all need to share, that impacts different people differently. And it impacts people depending on, you know, whether they're privileged enough to not have to worry about things like that. So it was like a real learning moment for me, and it's one that I try to carry forward into like other areas of my work and my life in general, like trying to think more about power dynamics when we were imposing rules. And so in a really similar way, like I learned so much from this book. Like it really, I challenge you to read this book and not learn something, not have one of those aha moments. Oh, I never thought about it that way. And I think that so the book does a lot of things, but I really think one of the most beautiful and important things it does is it questions a lot of dominant narratives, and it really challenges us to think differently. And what I want us to do is to keep doing that. So like to bring it to, you know, future technology and AI and stuff. So Shannon Ballard just published a book called The AI Mirror, and she makes this really powerful argument that our current AI technologies are basically just reproducing the past. That's all they're doing. They're reproducing the past with all of its flaws, like large language models, image generating. So we really need something very different from technology and something very different from ourselves as we move into this future. So I think that's true not just in the field of cyber law, but also like in the world in general with everything that's happening. So personally, I found the very brilliant and creative work in this book to be very inspiring in that way. And I hope you will too. And I hope that, like Amanda said, that this book is an engine. And I also hope that we can use cyber law as a Trojan horse. I love that idea. But yeah, I hope we all can carry forward this like critical thinking and openness so that we can continue making this field and also ourselves better.
Thank you so much to our speakers. I would love to take some questions. Alexandra, was that the hand?
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I'm raising my hand immediately because I have to leave. I thought this was fascinating and great, and I'm looking forward to looking at the book. I guess I'll ask just a, perhaps, I don't know if it's an easier question. Someone who's teaching cyber law right now, particularly to undergrads. I had Carrie Goldberg in my classroom, and it was quite an interesting experience. Some of my students, particularly the girls in their class, came to me at the end of class or sent me emails saying this was the best class I've ever been to in my entire life. And then some other people were very, very checked out and very uninterested, right? Particularly men. And so I'm wondering, I guess, like, what would be your strategies to try and include as broad a population as possible from the younger generations into these debates, because of course they're super important, they're more and more important. And so wondering what you would say, but also potentially if you have anything about how to design a course, how to kind of incorporate these insights throughout a course. I don't know if Amanda,
Yeah, Amanda question.
I might have had to drop off.
Oh, no, right.
I mean, I guess I'm happy to take a shot on it. I think one of the things I would say is that I think for me, from the perspective of thinking about like getting folks interested or excited about, you know, cyber law issues, but just generally anything, is that like people are excited when they get to pick the thing that they pay attention to or spend time on. And of course, in survey courses, like that's not necessarily possible. Like you sort of just get to be like, do whatever you want. But I think one thing Amanda has done very successfully, I know, in her teaching, and one thing I think about a lot, thought a lot about when I was doing teaching, was like, how do I create space for people to spend time on the thing that is most interesting to them? Because everyone is motivated, people are motivated to learn the most when they get to learn the thing that is, things for a question that they want to answer, not the questions I want to answer. I will also say, I think one of the challenges of sort of, feminists, sometimes writing on feminist cyberlaw, and I think one of the things the book does quite effectively, and one of the reasons I'm excited about is it is an engine, is that I think one of the challenges, and I think this is actually quite I'll say specifically in the 230 space, was that, and folks who do not spend time in this space, this is, Carrie Goldberg and I are probably on opposite sides of a pretty substantial disagreement over the politics of Section 230. But I think there's also this way in which Section 230 had become one of the few spaces in cyberlaw where you actually saw like women authors on the syllabus, right? Like it was folks with very critical takes on Section 230, and that it felt, I think this is less true now, but I think historically, like it's like, oh, Section 230 is like the feminists versus the like classic internet libertarians, right? And that I think we create space. One of the things that's exciting about the volume and also just about the breadth of work is that like creating space for feminists to disagree about the thing, right? Like that there can be multiple feminist takes on Section 230 or multiple feminist takes on, hashtags as marks, right? Like, thinking about like that if you can actually create an entire syllabus of people who disagree with each other, all of whom are starting from the same, like even some of the same values and principles, right? And that I think that to me feels important in sort of thinking about how do we make these conversations more inclusive and sort of more more sort of open to more people. Is just like if the only place that, and I don't think this is true of your classroom at all, but I'll, the only place women's who are in class see themselves on the syllabus is in the section that's critical of Section 230, then it's easy for that to be the thing where you're like, this is feminist cyberlaw. That's my thoughts. I don't know if folks have other ones.
So your question was kind of about undergrads, but I will answer with respect to law students, which is I think law students get so accustomed to reading cases and discussing cases and pulling out what the law is, and we don't often enough give them opportunities to think about the question like, oh, so the law looks neutral on its face, right? But how is it not neutral at all in application and in its history and its roots and in how things play out on the ground, right? And when you're teaching, I mean, particularly at a school like this, but I think everywhere, students are thinking ahead to how does this look when I am in practice? How does this actually play out in real life? And a lot of these questions, these feminist questions around access and equity and things like that, they become really clear when you look at these specific anecdotes or different outcomes for different groups or the statistics on, how things actually break down, who actually owns patents and copyrights and trademarks. Oh, I didn't know the discrepancy was so egregious. I think that that's one way to kind of invite people in and make them interested.
I mean, I don't teach, so I don't have great advice, but I do work with a bunch of hardcore engineers who have no fucking clue what social scientists do.
That counts as teaching.
Yeah. So I mean, but I don't know that I have good advice, but I am very much a fan of the Trojan horse strategy. So I'm constantly trying to make something interesting so that like to get people's attention and then like incept what I actually want them to learn. So for example, when I was trying to explain to the Institute what qualitative research is, I used the example that project that I did for my PhD thesis, which was about the porn industry. And a lot of them were interested in that topic for some reason. So this is probably really bad advice, but I also tried to do it in my book. My book feels very like pro technology and optimistic, but really like within it, like I tried to put some like pretty, I tried to incept some like critiques of unbridled corporate capitalism that I don't think people expected who, were the audience for the book. So.
Other questions? Yeah.
It's such a great book. I'll strongly recommend it if you haven't picked it up yet. And I'm seeing also not only do we have like a great group of scholars and friends and clinicians in the room here, I see several of our friends in the Zoom chat as well. And so I guess I'm curious what you think is next. So maybe so this work does a great job kind of pulling together all of these different threads, and in terms of like a syllabus injection tactic, it's like brilliantly easy now. Because it's like there is a chapter on whatever you're teaching next that you can engage with in your syllabus. So like Amanda's stated goal there is like totally achieved in my mind. But it is also like a little protean. It's like we're defining this kind of area of feminist cyberlaw or cyberlaw in a newly formed way. And I guess what do you think is the next version of the book? Like what should we be writing about? And maybe for the practitioners and clinicians here, for Jack and Mason and Victoria and others who are in the Zoom, what should we be doing? What are the cases we should be bringing? What are the issues we should be spotlighting as lawyers to sort of further the project along?
I wish Amanda was here.
Yeah, give the answer.
I mean, in terms of what's like the next volume, just reading through this and seeing the directions that people took this kind of call, and Amanda and Meg were very open-ended. They were like, this is the list of people that we want to write chapters. What should you write? Oh, whatever you feel is right. And so maybe this is weird to say, but like the existence of these totally disparate takes really just left me feeling like there could be so many more chapters, right? And if you asked more people, they would come up with so many more ways in which we can put a feminist or a disability or a critical race theory or whatever kind of spin on cyber law, and cyber law itself is so expansive, right? So I don't have a good answer to the cases question, but I think in envisioning future scholarship, there's so much more space and there's so much more to write. And I do kind of feel that energized feeling that this book is an engine and it opens up so many more possibilities and kind of gives us so many more ideas.
Yeah, this is really unfair, an unfair interpretation of your question, but like it feels kind of like if you view this not as feminist cyber law, but as cyber law, like would you be asking the same question if this was like it just seems like there's so much more of this. This isn't just like the one book where there's some like women's stuff. Like, more of this.
I think I'm gonna maybe like have I don't think I'm in disagreement with Kate, but a different take on it, which is I do think actually one of the things that's really interesting in the book is the degree to which it is cyber law that happens to be by people who have maybe a broader feminist agenda. And I think one weakness of it is that I think that meant that sometimes actually like the degree to which it was engaging with gender studies or feminist literature in particular is like less than I was personally excited about as someone who spent a lot of time teaching gender studies, right? So I think for me, like what I would love to see in some ways is a book that is less cyber law and more feminism, right? Like to say like, okay, if we started with the chapters being about particular feminist theories or ideas or thinkers, and we then, that was the framework through which, if this one underlines the cyber law, is there a feminist cyber law that underlines the feminism? Which I don't think I disagree with you, but I think like I think there is a way in which that means that it is an intervention into the cyber law scholarship. And I think I would be excited about sort of what cyber, like sort of the reciprocal intervention as well, where some of that work sort of circles around to engage with like other bodies of theories. And I think Ngozie's piece in particular in Feminist Cyberlaw does a great job of that. So that's my answer.
Yeah, or even just something that's more solidly interdisciplinary,
Yeah.
like this is like people kind of dipping their toe in, but you could do more, yeah. I agree.
Any last questions? All right, thank you so much. We're really grateful that you braved the rain and
Yes.
came out tonight, and it was great to see some friendly faces. And thank you very much to my panelists who are here in the room and my panelists who were on Zoom.
Thank you, Alex.
Yeah, thank you, Alex.